Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining this special Earth Day event, From Tragedy to Strategy. We have a very exciting program for you today. I'm joined by a wonderful and thought-provoking panel group of strategy and future experts who I will introduce shortly. But first, I should introduce myself. My name is Andy. I will be the moderator today. I am a planet-centric designer at the company Vincit in Helsinki, Finland. I'm joined by my colleague Carolina, who would like to introduce herself now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carolina Faria. I'm also a planet-centric designer at Vincit. And later today, we're going to have a chance to have a Q&A with the panelists. And I will be picking up your questions and asking them to the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Carolina. So before we get into the panel discussion, we're going to share a few slides with you and kind of set the context for this event so we know what we're getting into today. Okay. One moment. Okay, so you made it to the right event. This is From Tragedy to Strategy. Some of you may know this, some may not. This is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And on these sort of anniversaries or birthdays, this is a moment of reflection, I think, for most people. It's a time when you look back and you ask yourself, what have I been up to? What have I been doing with my time? And if we are to look back over the last 50 years, we've been quite busy, maybe not always in a good way. The environmental movement has been progressing, but at the same time, so has unsustainable growth. If you look here on the left, we have Earth Overshoot Day. This is the day when the Earth's renewable resources are used up, and every year, this kind of gets earlier and earlier in the year. And then on the right here, this is, I'm sure, no surprise to anybody, but the CO2 has been rising, accelerating too, over the last 50 years. Where we're at now, actually, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere we haven't seen since our species has been around. So this is really unprecedented, and this has happened largely in the last 50 years. So actually, this is also a time to think about where we want to go on an anniversary or a birthday. What is the future that I want to have? And so luckily, we have some information from the UN giving us some hints of where we might want to end up. By the end of this century, it's actually not that far away if you think about it. I don't have kids, but if I did have kids, my kids could be around in 2100. So at that time, we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is an ambitious target, but it's the best one that we have, and it's really something that we should be aiming for. What this means, though, is that in the next 10 years, we would need to halve our global emissions. Excuse me, and what this means each year until 2030 would actually be a 7.6 decrease in global emissions. Put this into some perspective, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're actually seeing there's predictions for a 5% decrease. So even with everything that's happened, we're only looking at 5%. And of course, it's all for the wrong reasons. We want happy people, we want healthy people. This is how we want to get that reduction. But still, there's a ways to go. The good news is that we know where we need to go. We know those targets, and we know when we want to get there. We know this from the UN. So what this means here is that we actually need strategy to get us to those targets. And this is kind of the frame for this event. This is why we thought this would be important today on Earth Day. And something that we'll do a little bit different today, a little bit of a disclaimer, is that we're not going to do this event in a way where we're going to tell you what the future is going to be. This is more about providing tools, getting you inside the mind of strategy and futures experts, kind of learning some of the terminology and the concepts and the way of working to help you realize the strategies in your own work, wherever you are. Okay, so I should say that this is a Earth Day event. We are partnered up with We Don't Have Time. They have a climate conference going on all week, which you can find some content for that afterwards. I'll do a plug for that. I'm working at Vincit, Caroline and I, and we are part of the planet-centric design team. Quick message about Vincit. We have a vision to create a world without fear for tomorrow. And this is where planet-centric design has really been born out of, to realize that. And doing events like this is one of the ways that we are working towards that vision. Okay, really quickly, I'll go over the agenda. So right now we're doing an introduction. Then we will have 1 hour with our panelists. Hopefully this is enough time. And then we'll do a Q&A after that. And so the important thing to note here is that during the whole event on YouTube, you can you'll see a link for pigeonhole.at/planet, where you can write your questions throughout the whole conversation, and we will find them and we will direct them to the panelists during the Q&A. And you can even vote there, so also can make it a bit more democratic. And if you're not able to get the Pigeonhole, you can just write your messages on YouTube and we'll find them there as well. But then we will do a wrap up after that, next steps, and talk about the next event that we have coming up. But I guess we can get right into the panel discussion now. I'll do a quick introduction. Who we have here today, really exciting to be talking with everybody. We have Dr. İdil Gaziulusoy. She is a assistant professor of sustainable design, leader of the Notice Research Group at Aalto University in Finland. Amos Taylor is project researcher at Finland Futures Research Center out in Turku, Finland. Jyri-Mikko Oranen is CEO at Team Media Relations here in Helsinki. And Katri Vataja, who is strategy and foresight director at Sitra here in Helsinki. And I will turn this over. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So just going to get set up here and I will turn this over to our panelists. So hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so I did a quick intro there. You guys heard what the program is. Let's get going. But before we get into, what is the future going to be? I think we should kind of start by defining some terms, for our audience here. Talking about, I mentioned futures, I mentioned strategy. Before we get into it, can we start by defining, what are futures, and for that matter, what are, future studies? Maybe Amos and İdil, you'd like to tackle that one.
Sure. Amos, maybe you go ahead and then I'll pick up.
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute. So I'm at the Finland Futures Research Center, and so we have been having our center for 25 years, the University of Lapland. So it's actually possible to study a degree in future studies and do a master's degree and a PhD. And we have several people working on various different projects to deal with the future. And future studies really engages what the future images of the future might be, the possible futures, the preferable futures, and really it's a way of strategically or systematically engaging uncertainty and complexity. So the future hasn't happened here yet. We don't predict the future. We don't look into a crystal ball. Definitely not. That's not even interesting to look at what is predicted as the business as usual. What is more interesting is to look at the individual perspectives on the future and to unpack those.
Well, because I am interested in my research is about sustainability transformations, which are long-term dynamic processes that are underlined with quite a lot of uncertainty. That's how I am associated with future studies. So, but I mean, future studies has a quite broad range of theories and methods, and it looks at a broad range of futures, possible, probable, plausible, also preposterous. So I'm specifically interested in normative futures, and associated with that normative foresight methods and tools, which deal with understanding what might be unfolding, but kind of pulling the trajectories of present day unfolding towards visions that are desirable and sustainable and post-carbon. So that's how I'm associated with future studies, and I use it extensively in my work, although I'm not a futures scholar per se.
Okay, thank you. Not to say that strategy is something different than futures, but I'm wondering, how would we describe strategy? Miko or Katri, would you like to talk about that?
Sure.
Yeah. Would you like to start?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to start. Well, I obviously approach this topic from a business angle, and I see strategy as the game plan for success, whatever success is, however we want to define it. As a concept, very much is made of strategy sometimes, and the whole topic tends to get overcomplicated. In essence, it's actually about a very simple question. How are we going to succeed? If you want to break it down, you can expand it to 3 key questions. 1, what do we want to achieve? 2, where are we playing? What does the field look like? And 3, in what way can we secure success? How do we need to focus, and what kind of skills and systems do you need? And of course, another way to look at it is from a point of differentiation. What sets us apart from the rest of the pack? There we want to define our strategic sweet spot or unique competing space, if you like. And there the key or critical question would be, what is it that we can do that the stakeholders want that competitors can't do? In other words, where are we unique now, and where can we be unique in the future?
I could continue. My definition is pretty much the same, although I've been working with strategy mostly in public sector or third sector organizations. And for me, strategy is about choices, what we want to do and achieve. It's also a game plan, or it's about how we can achieve success, as Miko said, but the success is defined in different ways. How can we create value? How can we have impact on society? And to me, strategy is part of leadership, and it gives a shared direction and meaning to our work.
Okay. I'm interested in, when a lot of people talk about strategy, and I feel like sometimes it can get conflated with some sort of other activity. Maybe this is called tactical or operational. When are we not talking about strategy? And feel free to, I'll jump in there if you'd like.
I could start saying that sometimes I feel that strategy as a concept is a quite too loaded, or if someone sees it's too linear, or from the traditional view of strategic paradigm as a strategic planning, for example. Sometimes I feel that it's easier to talk about strategic thinking and talk about content and what kind of questions we have to ask. So not talking about a strategy as such, but what it means and how can we use strategy and strategic thinking and why it's important.
The terminology is a quagmire, a minefield. You can get lost in it easily. I think in real life terms, if we look at strategy, we can define it as an overall plan, and then the rest of the things you do is action tactics, whatever you want to call it. But the thing there is not to go too deep into semantics. Strategy is a plan, and shouldn't be made into anything bigger than an overall plan. That's at least my point of view.
I see that the strategy is very much an interesting phenomenon to criticize and to unpack, and because it holds within it so many assumptions about what the future is and where you're going. And the problem with the strategy can be that we have decided on our board from top down that this is the direction we're going, and we're going to stick to it no matter what. And then the world changes, and the world doesn't necessarily work like that. Even with the best intentions, the strategy can be kind of a terrible blinder on the future, for organizations especially.
Yeah. I'll jump in about that. And in my work, I do understand strategy, again, similar to Katri's way of understanding it, as at kind of systemic level. Of course, individual businesses do make strategy in order to compete and succeed and direct their innovation, etc. But in the context of sustainability transformations, strategy needs to be understood, or strategy making needs to be understood and practiced as a very dynamic process and a very adaptable process, because the timeframes that are relevant in the context of sustainable transformations is a little bit different than how businesses make and implement strategy, which in our terms quite short-term focused. So one question is, how can we make societal level strategies, and how can we make sense of those strategies within individual organizations, within institutions, within policies, etc. So I see strategy as very relevant to futures and futures making, but not necessarily as a plan, because my understanding of a plan is a kind of more structured entity with deadlines and action points and etc., which are necessary, but in the context of longer term changes, I think strategy needs to acknowledge the uncertainty of the processes that underlie transformation processes, which require different approaches to strategy making.
Okay, really interesting. I can tell that there are definitely many different ways to look at these terms, and that we wouldn't want to necessarily get too bogged down in them. So I think I'll go on to the next question. And I'll kind of preface that, what we're experiencing today with the pandemic and COVID-19, there's a lot of talk about what's happening today, but we have to, similar to Earth Day, looking back and reflecting, because it is the anniversary, we have to look back and understand that what's happening today is a long-term process. It's the latest in the long-term process, and this didn't just happen in isolation. There were a lot of precedents that led to today. And so before talking more about the future, I'm wondering if we could go back a little bit and unpack some of the predominant strategies that have been in play, whether it's in government or in the private sector, that led to where we're at, what we're experiencing today with the unprecedented pandemic. And maybe Jarmiko, you'd like to jump off with that.
Sure. I'll start with the corona, although we're not supposed to be talking only about the pandemic. But what corona has done, it has probably awakened us to an element of surprising levels of unpredictability in the operational environment. In Western and Nordic civilization, at least, we have been living in fairly stable circumstances for a very long time. You know, there are not that many people around who remember the horrors of the Second World War firsthand, for instance. Therefore, a great deal of our strategies has been based on continuity, and now we are facing severe discontinuity in the form of the pandemic. And one of the relevant questions is whether the scenario work for this pandemic was there at the governmental level around the world. The warning signs had been clearly articulated by the scientific community, yet we did on a global level let our guards down, hence the current sense of vulnerability and fear. So to kind of sum up, an element of extrapolation, if you like, assuming that things will go as previously in strategies, in futures thinking is an enormously risky business. And let us hope that this is what will change in strategic thinking in the private sector and public sector alike as a result of the pandemic, that we learn to expect the unexpected. That's the great change with regard, I hope, to past strategies and future strategies.
I do think that the current pandemic, I agree with Yurimiko. A couple of things to add to that is, I think before Corona, at least in businesses, one of the contexts that I am interested in my research, there has been quite a lot of talk in the past 50 years about sustainability risks, climate change, etc., but we haven't seen much action. And action has been predominantly about increasing efficiencies and, you know, reducing impacts rather than dealing with transformation. And talking about stability in Nordic civilizations, in the global civilizational level, we have been enjoying a relatively stable climate for 10,000 or more years, which actually, you know, overseen agricultural revolution and industrial revolution, etc. So now that has been for a long time, that has been undermined. But with the, I think with the crisis that we are experiencing as a result of Corona, I'm hoping that both businesses, but also governments, as well as individuals, realize that we are not immune at all to collapse, to crisis, and we need to ramp up our resilience. And resilience thinking is very different than efficiency thinking. So I'm hoping to see that resilience thinking will start to become more dominant in strategic conversations, both in business, but also in government.
Great, and I think we'll definitely get more into this resilience thinking. But before getting there, did anybody else want to add to some of the, you know, how we kind of ended up here? What were the strategies at play?
I think that there is definitely been a problem that we have been in a kind of a bubble where we're really looking at only at humanity and ignoring. This is another key indicator with the coronavirus, that we're kind of ignoring these outside factors. So the planet and the environment, and we're looking for technological fixes, and then when sudden changes come, they really can disrupt the direction of change, or not even the direction of change, but how change is feeling. So everybody can feel it differently now. So I think there's a element of emergence, that something is very much different now than before, and I think there's an opportunity for governments to learn. Definitely, I think this is a really great training for what will come next, whatever that will be.
Yeah, I could add and complement the others that in general, the issue is that the time scale or horizons of strategies is too short. And when it's too short and focused on efficiency, as Idil said, they don't have space for renewal and how to build capacity for renewal and thus resilience for emergent issues or surprises. And somehow this current situation can change this and open futures thinking. Also, it's more pressure to think different time scales and horizons when thinking of future and how we can get out of this situation. But there is now also risks that we focus too much on current situation, that we don't build bridges to the future and to future visions. And how can we build future in today and what we are doing today in today's actions?
Yeah, so I think you're all kind of alluding to the fact that the same strategies that have been at play that led to COVID have a really close connection to sustainability, the environmental movement. Is there any kind of last words you'd want to say maybe about just the connection here between what led to COVID-19 and how this is also connected to the environmental crisis generally?
Well, essentially, COVID is a manifestation of what happens when you mess up with ecosystems without forethought. If you have been following, scientific discussions about the origin, you do see quite intricate connections between the ecosystems that we have been interfering in quite heavily and how they, how they respond to that in return. So how COVID has come to existence is very relevant to how we relate to ecosystems and how we engage with ecosystems and how we see ecosystems, whether from a utilitarian point of view or whether from a coexistence, systemic point of view.
Okay, thank you, Idil. Okay, well, I guess we can maybe move into the next question here. So basically what we've done is define some terms and talk about, what was the past strategies. And now let's talk a little bit more about this moment that we're in. We don't want to focus too much on COVID-19, but it is a good kind of gateway into the conversation about the environment. So obviously there's been a lot of content created talking about what are we experiencing right now, and what is the daily news, who said this, who said that. But something that I don't think has been talked about, and I think you all have very good kind of expertise to talk about this, is what is the scale of the situation we're in with the pandemic? How do we actually what do we call this moment that we're in? Is this is this some sort of collapse? Is this some sort of systemic change? How would you kind of quantify this and define this moment? And I'll leave this open to the group. Whoever just wants to jump in.
Well, I don't think that we can name what this period right now very correctly. I think we will be able to make that assessment a little bit down the track in retrospect. But this moment holds quite a lot of seeds for a lot of things. And that kind of requires, reflectively engaging with strategic thinking, in addition to, responding to the immediacy of what is unfolding on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I agree very much with Idil that we don't know yet, or we don't know how large or how far-reaching impact this pandemic will have. But we know that it will change something and change a lot. and future or futures is more open now, and that's why it's important to recognize what kind of changes are possible or more possible now, and how these changes could be systemic, and what kind of paradigm shift is able to do now. And it's I've seen that it's a strong agreement that something will change and something new will happen, but many actors use this moment in different ways and for their own purposes. And that's why it's important to recognize where are the points where we decide the future paths, for example, and how can we be more aware of those choices or place of choices.
Definitely, there seems to be an element that right here that the future is kind of closing in. So we're living in a kind of the end of something, the closing of something. So some things have to collapse. But then we have this other side of that is the open future. So we're trying to open up new pathways to the future. This is really like kind of very much an uncertain time. Things are in flux, but in other ways, everything is going on as normal. The birds don't necessarily notice the difference that we feel, you know.
One way to look at this is that we're in the eye of a hurricane, or a hurricane is over us, and it's probably fair to note that due to our distortion of perspective, there is currently a great temptation to overestimate the impact of Corona. After all, it's by no means unique in the history of mankind. Just consider the Spanish flu 100 years ago. And COVID-19's impact, I'm not saying that it's significant, of course. There's absolutely no reason to play it down in terms of human suffering, but its impact will be small compared to, say, the Black Death, at least in the light of current knowledge. In a matter of a couple of years ago, because advances in science and so forth, Corona will blow away. However, I think we can be realistic to hope that we learn that this is a fair nudge in a good direction in global collaboration and handling of crises, rather than, you know, cataclysmic change with regard to societal transformation. Let's hope this is a nudge. The Spanish flu 100 years ago kicked off a wave of governments starting to think about national healthcare. Let's hope we see similar evolutions in healthcare, in the relationship between businesses, society, and population at large. And let's hope this is a nudge, a good, fair nudge in our attitude to the looming environmental crisis.
I think for me, what's important is with the onset and the evolution of COVID situation, what happened that gives me hope is that all of a sudden everyone became aware of the concept of futures, because, you know, everyone's futures or perception of how the future is going to be like for them, for their family, for their country, has shifted in a very, you know, with a very rapid in a very rapid way. So as much as I agree with Yerimiko that you know, history has been full of similar disruptive situations, I think we are at a kind of critical moment in human history, because we have to mitigate and adapt to climate change in a very short period of time. And action and collaboration has been forming, but not at the pace that it has been necessary. So indeed, maybe with this, with the learnings at individual, organizational, governmental, global levels, because a lot of learning is happening at the moment. If we do start to reflect on what we are learning and how that learning can translate into these, the systemic challenges that have been going on for a while, in a way to address them, I think, some good might come out of this. That's why I said I see a lot of seeds, but I'm not really sure whether we will be able to nurture those seeds or not. And in one addition for what Katri said about this is a time to think about, when are the decision-making points? Definitely, but also we need to think about who to involve in those decisions, because we are now realizing that the societies we have built are underlined by a lot of injustices. We knew this, but this was normalized. Now we are seeing that it's actually not okay, not from an economic, but also from an ethical perspective.
I fully agree. This is an opportunity for all of us, and hopefully this has made us realize that we need a global approach to crisis, because the next crisis will be a lot bigger than this one. I'm of course referring to what's happening with the planet.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting. I'm noticing some, with the futures closing or possibilities closing and new futures opening, there's definitely a tension there. And then, this tension between, there has been, pandemics before, but this one maybe because of the time that we're in with the planet, that we can't let it go back to business as usual, that there has to be an adapt and that we have to learn from this. So I think that's really, really interesting point. There's some tensions there. And this kind of brings us to the next question, which is, getting to, what we can do in the future. And something that we talked about a little bit before this event in our pre-conversations was that, to be able to find these leverage points and to, figure out who to involve in this, there needs to be some kind of skill developments in society. And we talked about adaptation, we talked about transformation. And it seems like from our conversations that we need to develop this capacity for adaptation and transformation. So I'm wondering if you guys could talk to, what are the tools that we need to be able to handle a crisis like this and crisis even bigger, regarding climate change and planetary health. What are some of the tools that we need to tackle that? And this is open to the group. Feel free to just jump in.
I could easily continue what Idil said about hope and agency. And in this situation, when future is open, but it's also more, it's not so clear. I think it's important to strengthen people's hope and to build their own capacity to think about futures and to dream and think bigger and wider what is possible and what is a desired future, and thus to increase their trust in the future. And at this moment, we know that the future will be different anyway because of COVID, but in every despite of it. But we have to build capacity to think that the future can be also better in many ways. And there is no hope that the status quo could remain. And that's why we have to be responsible of the major challenges and how we can meet them in sustainable manner. And I think this is not, it's not able to do it top down, but we need also bottom up movement and activity, as Idil mentioned before. We need everything on the board. It's politics is decision making, but it's also about culture in many ways, and how we think and what we value, and so on.
One of the things is that we would really need what is called futures literacy, which is a new term, fairly new term, and it's an ability in which to acknowledge the uses of future. So how the future is represented and used, and to understand that it is not only one narrative, that individuals have their own perspectives within that, and they're highly loaded, but they are also something that can lead to emergence of something new. Emergence is the other element there, that things are always changing, and we have an ability to notice those changes, those little weak signals that might become something else, or that could be influenced and jumped upon. In our work, we think very much about this kind of world-making perspectives. So we're that sitting around here in each of our perspectives, we have different worldviews on and sense-making things about how the world works, and our own kind of assumptions and drives, and these are all correct future perspectives, and we need to understand this kind of diversity very much. And if we are able to do that, we are able then to kind of be more literate and more capable to engage the future.
I think following up from what Amos and Katri said, so Katri said that we need to cultivate thinking and belief that futures can be better. And Amos was talking about futures literacy and the diversity of futures held by, different groups and individuals. So in that regard, I think one tool quite important, I would say, is systems innovation. So innovation is understood in a very narrow way more often than not. When we talk about innovation, we talk about new products, services, or technologies. But there are also, innovations taking place at cultural, societal, or socio-technical system level. So if I link this back to, sustainable transformations, I think it's important to, yes, holding belief that futures can be better, but we might along the way need to redefine for us what better actually means. So for system innovation, for example, businesses need to collaborate together with other businesses as well as with policymakers, etc. But collaboration has not necessarily been a favored practice, because there is a trade-off between competition and collaboration. So when we think about what are those better futures, maybe we should also start to unpack what are those concepts that have not been serving, or that are not anymore serving to the futures that we think to be better. And I think at the moment, a lot of learning is happening in relation to what is better for, from the perspective of individuals and organizations, employees, people, families, governments, etc. So there is a lot to explore and reflect on, I think, on, what is better, what is a better future, or what are better futures? How do we define better in this context and from now on?
A very practical point, Idil, you previously mentioned the concept of resilience and obviously managing a crisis such as COVID or the environmental crisis. actually requires access to resources, be they material, monetary, or otherwise. And certainly many organizations will be looking at their balance sheet in a new light now. For instance, how much cash do we need available to get over a crisis such as COVID? And I'm sure a lot of households are in the process of thinking about the same thing. And in addition, I think we need agile thinking right now, flexibility, and we do need to be able to let go of the past, bravely entering a new world of workable solutions. And purely from a business point of view, in tackling future events, foresight will be key. Understanding and accepting the plausible futures, and again, expecting the unexpected.
Okay, really interesting. So, okay, what I'm hearing is we need futures literacy. We're talking about hope and being critical about where we've been and letting go of some things. What does this kind of mean? Like on an ethical standard, we talked about where decisions should be made. Top down, bottom up. Can we talk a little bit more about that? Like how does it actually? How does this kind of work? Once we have some futures literacy, where are the decisions being made? How does this kind of work between companies and between citizens and government? Feel free to jump in, whoever would like to.
Well, I could refer to transition arenas, for example. One of the quite well-known, both theoretical but also practical approach in governing, long-term sustainability transformations that are basically underlined with a lot of uncertainty, and transition arenas bring together, actors from science, from business, from policymaking, and traditionally, the public have not necessarily been included in those arenas. So those arenas have been, to a large extent, participatory but elite areas where decisions are being made. But now two things are happening. One, we are observing that transitions have not been happening with the pace that we predicted them to happen. So there's a call for, okay, we need to do things differently. And then some transitions are already unfolding. So it's important to engage forefront thinkers in the front end of transitions, because, imagining alternative futures is requires a certain level of training, expertise, etc. But as transitions are unfolding, we need to bring on board everyone practically. So these transition arenas, or whatever we want to call them, need to be opened up for more democratic input. And there are, in practice, all sorts of ways to do that.
In a way, it's some kind of transformative agency, we'd like to maybe call it, that individuals have the ability and the means to be part of the conversation and part of the means to transform themselves. Maybe it's some kind of, we can think of it some kind of bootstrapping, but that also seems like an individual process. This is kind of more collective, and where innovation is seen in different ways. So you might have incremental innovation. It might be meaningful, incremental, or just one step up. Or you might have radical innovation that disrupts things. They can be experimental, and then maybe it might lead to something, or it might just have been one big shock. Then you could think of game-changing innovations that, okay, now this is the way we're going to go. There's a new trend in collective innovation, the way we think about things. Then another way would be this systemic transformation, and the innovation is then across the board transformed. But that is something that not necessarily happens from top down. This is something that really we have to look at, kind of embrace this kind of grassroots approaches. And I think what Idil, you're talking about also is this relates to kind of ecosystem perspective for businesses and society, that we don't, business models are not just made for an individual company. You kind of think about the co-collaboration and the societal spillover effects that will happen, and you kind of embrace that, even if you don't necessarily get direct monetary gain from that. So we might have companies that are set up to make a loss, but because they do good.
I think we need a global approach to the problem and the solution. It's not going to be something that Finland or Switzerland or China for that matter can do alone. And as both Idil and Amos said, we need broad-based buy-in among the population at large. They need to participate. Everybody needs to participate in the solution. I think in the short term, we need to facilitate technology adoption to make the planet come one, ramp up the curve. Digital skills have proven their worth in the current crisis, and as we've seen, digitalization has already taken a major leap in many areas. But as has been discussed, there is a much more burning or searing aspect to the whole discussion, because on the grand scale of things, this corona is just a light overture before the bigger crisis hits us. In light of data, we need to underline this, because I don't think our acceptance of the fact is at a sufficient level currently. We are fast heading into a full-blown ecological catastrophe. The planet's resources are depleting as the human race has overgrown the Earth's limits. And the predictions that we might reach the apex of this development is in 10 years. And how ready are we actually to tackle this situation? If we looked at how we handled corona so far, we're not going to be picture perfect, are we? And the critical question here is, what can we learn from the current pandemic and start creating the scenarios and practices for tackling the environmental crisis seems inevitable. I'm basing what I'm saying on a slightly pessimistic scenario here, not assuming that we will be able to prevent the environmental crisis anymore. We've had this foresight since the 70s at least. That's 50 years, my friends. But we humans tend to refuse to accept danger before we actually face it. And in the case of the environment, we're going to be facing it very, very soon indeed. But I think therein lies the hope too. We are now aware of the importance of future thinking, and at the very last minute, humanity hopefully tends to pull together and tackle the crisis. There's going to be a great deal of tragedy involved, but we will come out somehow, just like we will with Corona. It takes intelligence, it takes initiative, and I think we need global solidarity, but I have full faith in that we will pull through. And this experience of the Corona crisis, I hope, will help us on a societal level in leveraging technology and in transforming our value base on the way to a more sustainable future.
Actually, building on that, the importance of foresight and the fact that foresight has actually been around for a long time, although, of course, the focus and practices of and politics of foresight have changed or diversified, let's call it. One thing that I would like to say in relation to, where to focus attention. One reason why we maybe are not engaging with certain types of foresight that are not quantitative is because there is, in all sorts of institutions in society, there is a lot of attachment to working with what is measurable, what is quantifiable, but there are certain things that have higher potency in changing systems that are not necessarily easily quantifiable or quantifiable at all, such as worldviews and values. And if we talk about systemic change, long-term transformation, this moment being, being a moment for or opening several alternative futures that we could choose and work towards co-creating, we really need to start to engage with going back to the tools and capacities with, for example, stories, metaphors, because the way that we change worldviews and values or work with worldviews and values is not through numbers. It is through stories. It is through language. It is through, through those mechanisms that values and worldviews change, not through, basically tax-related interventions or numerical interventions.
That was a good point, and we need a new kind of models for decision making and how we can use different kind of data and information, which is not exact or numbers or quantitative, and many of our decision making processes or forums are used to utilize this kind of data, which is simple. and the information data can say what to do, what we have to do, but this current situation has proved how difficult it is to do quick actions based on unsecure data, on unsecure information knowledge, and we need more interpretation, more diverse information, and so it's different models to act in simple word and now in this kind of VUCA complex word, or even chaos, in middle of chaos. And that's important discussion and important to develop that kind of capacity to how to act in this kind of environment now and future too.
Might also consider that in the previous summers there was the Thai boys football team who were stuck in the cave, and the solution for it was not a technical solution. The solution came from a diverse team of highly specialized, highly talented international collaboration to solve the problem. So the problem solving is not coming from, for example, Elon Musk's rocket ship that so it wasn't a one hit one day, it's really like across the board, and really to acknowledge this, the skills and the individuals have. And I think the coronavirus is also the same, where we have people on the front lines who we have to kind of depend on their skills and their interpretations, and we have to kind of follow that kind of narrative, collective narrative. Hopefully it leads to something positive.
I think we need to see technology as a facilitator and acknowledge the importance of technology. But as Amos said, we need to acknowledge that it's not about SpaceX or Mars cars. And referring to worldviews and values, how Elon Musk has been promoting his SpaceX project is because we trash the planet, we got to colonize other planets. Well, that is a worldviews and values problem. We have a wonderfully beautiful planet, And it's the only planet, as far as we know, that can support complex life, including human life. And why don't we actually look after it rather than putting millions and millions of dollars into developing nonsensical technologies? I mean, they're nonsensical in the context of now and probably in the context of ever. And reminding you, digitalization has been immensely instrumental in keeping everyone connected, getting work done, keeping everyone sane. But the two technologies that, actually the technology and the behavior that are most important and fundamental for us to avoid or manage the pandemic are ancient ones. So it's hand washing and soap. And we have had technologies to tackle sustainability crisis. We do have the technologies. We don't necessarily need to mindlessly develop new technologies, but we really need to be more, rather than being technologically optimistic and technocentric, we need to understand that all of this is actually for people and for humans and non-humans. We need to be carefully considering what kind of technologies we need, and whether we need to develop certain types of technologies, etc. These are very relevant to ethical questions and questions about worldviews and values. And our current society is unfortunately geared to push for ongoing technological development without much reflection on whether we need it, or what kind of implications these technologies have on society and on planet.
This is an important point, that we have to talk about values when we talk about transformation, and about technology as a part of transformation, how we use technologies. I think it's not technology as such, is not good or bad, but how we use it, how we use data, who owns our data, and it's about values, it's about human rights, and etc. And who creates vision for transformation, and how we use technology in that kind of vision. And do we have capacity to talk about those things? How we understand, and could we understand what happens to our data, for example, in this kind of situation with technology, in current situation, technology is used for solving pandemic, for example, and what happens at the same time? Do we abandon some rights for, and do we know what happens right now? I think it's extremely important to talk about values and ethical dimensions too. Yeah.
Jaromiko, would you like to add anything else? I think we're getting towards the end here, but feel free to have a few more comments.
No, I agree with basically everything that's been said. Technology is but a tool. Perhaps one point of view is that as people would like to come up with new things, and I don't think that tendency is going anywhere, regardless of what happens with COVID or the environment. So this technological push is kind of innate to humanity, and it is our role in the entire world to make sure it's used in for good of the humanity and the planet.
There is definitely, I think, we are social as well as creative creatures. So creating something new is a big kick for us. But I think that the systems that underlie our current society maybe prioritizes technological development over anything else that is new. there are a lot of communities innovating new ways of organizing, for example, and we actually owe the very first, response to the crisis to those innovations being in place. Because before top-down aid and top-down help can come, can become functional in any crisis situations, we know that it's self-organization that saves lives, or that saves assets, or etc. So I don't think we need to push technology development at the expense of anything else. I think there needs to be a balance, and we really need to understand the importance of social innovation and support social innovation, which doesn't necessarily have, an associated IP. But then this is a question of, what is value creation in society, and how should we distribute resources across all of the relevant areas, including but not limited to technology development.
Well, I think that is a really great place to leave it, the question of, what is value creation? And this is definitely a moment to be thinking about that. I think what we've covered basically is, some terms, what is futures, what is strategy. We talked about how certain possibilities are closing and some are opening at this moment, and that we need to be critical, of where we've been, and kind of understand what do we want to keep with us and move forward with, and then how can we adapt and transform for the next even larger crisis regarding the planetary health. I want to thank everybody for participating. We still have a little bit more. We have the Q&A coming up. And I will, for that, turn it over to Carolina, and she will have the questions for you in just a moment.
Yeah, thank you so much to the panelists, and also to everyone who has been watching and adding questions. So one of the questions we had was from Emma. How can employees/individuals participate in the transformation we are now undergoing to contribute to the sustainability transition? And I think this one connects with another question we have here, if you can kind of refer to both. As an individual employee voter, are there any ways I can ensure that my choices are impacting towards positive future change? So, Katri, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can start. It's good question, and relates to how individual people can have impact and influence. And I think it starts with futures thinking, for example, how to be aware, and I think it starts with interest in futures too, and what kind of changes is happening, and to understand and making sense of environment, and what kind of changes, what kind of mega trends or weak signals are going on, and something to have a big picture, so that people could see what kind of effects their own activities have. And one very concrete example could be to find out what is the carbon footprint. That's a very concrete example what people have done more and more lately, that they could see what kind of effect they have, what they could do more, how they could reduce their own emissions, and also how they can not only changing their own behavior, how they live and how they travel, or what they eat, but also to be more aware how they could have more impact in citizens, how they vote, what kind of citizen activism they can practice, for example, and somehow to find their own ways to have impact.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was quite a great overview. Does anyone else want to add on top?
Yeah, I just would like to say that, I mean, individuals or businesses don't exist in a vacuum. We are part of a larger system. So one very important, I think, attitude is to really work within networks, reach out. And the second thing is, there was this question of how can I make sure that what I'm doing is achieving certain, change results. Well, that's for me, I think what is really important in relation to transformations related work is patience, and also not being attached to outcomes or achieving outcomes, because the outcomes are not going to fruit in the short term. So I would argue and strongly advise that we focus on processes and ask questions around what kind of processes actually can enable our actions and thoughts to be channeled towards transformative directions. I am working towards futures that I am not going to experience at all. So if I were attached to, outcomes that I would see immediately fruiting in front of my eyes, I wouldn't be doing this work. So transformation work requires really, I think, being focused on process rather than outcome.
Okay, that's a great point as well. Thank you, Idil. Yirimiku, would you like to add to these points?
Building on that, what everyone can do today, beside of voting and being part of a democratic system and making sure that our governments remain democratic, is of course talk to the companies whose products you buy. Make yourself vocal, and that includes, of course, government organizations as well. But if you look at leading enterprises in this world, they have understood the change, the great sustainability transformation that is taking place. They understand that the stakeholder expectations are changing. We see in research data that responsibility or sustainability, name it whatever you want, is becoming more and more important to the population at large, day by day. And they are leading enterprises in the world are very much geared towards creating shared value as much as they can. Make yourself heard, talk to them, be vocal.
Thank you. Yeah, it was nice to get different kinds of points of view on this. And now to Amos, another question so that we can go, we can answer more of these. If we need global collaboration and re-examining values, changing mental models, how do you see the rising level of nationalism affecting these efforts?
That's definitely the flip side to all this kind of really optimistic views of how things have been going. There is equally this other force of kind of science denial going on, and it's kind of going against the grain, which is kind of again comes back to this kind of closing futures and opening futures perspective, and you're going to have this clash. I've also read that the Spanish flu, so after the Spanish flu there was the roaring 1920s, but that also then after that there was the rise of fascism. So we can also keep an eye out for that, to make sure that doesn't happen, that not to be complacent in this kind of because it's not all going to be very easy at all to kind of justify these difficult actions, because they're very unclear to us ourselves.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to build on top of these points?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this time of area, what is called post-normal times, and it requires many kind of capacity we have talked about today. But I'm thinking about the people, how they feel this chaos and surprises, and what kind of counter forces, flip sides might arise, as Amos refers. And that is something we have to be aware, and how people try to control or somehow manage this world, which is uncertain and full of surprises. And it relates to interdependencies, which is a cause of complexity. And this pandemic has shown very concretely, has made very evident that we need global solution, we need global cooperations, and that's why it's very important to be aware how can we actually it goes back to how to get on board everybody, and that we understand how we can get a big transformation forward.
Yeah, something to really pay attention to.
Yeah.
Does anyone else want to build on top of this?
Well, essentially, at a very general level, at any given time for any given question, there is going to be, opposing views on how to approach that question. That's part of the given. If that is the case, then I guess all I can say is we need to be able to understand that there are power dynamics in this, in this situation. And we're probably not going to be able to manage all of those power dynamics, etc. But we need to be aware of them. We need to include them in our analysis and in our thinking, and work with them, also work around them. So power is a concept that is quite often overlooked, but incredibly important when it comes to, these historical moments when the large society is kind of, trying to find its next path. So power is a very important concept that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very good point. I think I'll move on to the last question, since to just try to use better time. How to approach governments and the private sector to take a more strategic, collaborative thinking to tackle future disasters and increase community resilience. Idil, would you like to start?
Sure. Stakeholder pressure. Stakeholder pressure and stakeholder pressure. Nothing in this world happens without stakeholder pressure. In the COVID crisis, we have seen that when the stakeholder pressure is strong enough, things happen very, very quickly indeed. And to put it very shortly, that's the key in getting governments and the private sector together as well. We need to make ourselves heard.
Thank you. Yeah, this really connects with the point you made before as well. Does anyone else want to build on top?
I also think that articulating the picture for businesses that sustainability issues are imposing existential questions and existential threat on businesses through research and through dialogue is quite important as well.
Just a quick one on that. Let's think about, motor cars right now. We're in the process of traditional combustion engine becoming wholly unacceptable from an ethical point of view because of planetary consideration. The question is just about the breaking point. When the alternate technologies will be mature enough and the stakeholder pressure will be strong enough, it will be goodbye petrol-based car engines. This just as one example.
Yeah, thank you. Amos, Katri, would you like to have any words on this question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the way, from a Finnish perspective, the government have tried to approach this by utilizing kind of a transparency and the transparency process and that clearly the people and companies understand the kind of their role within this, but that could be still developed a lot further. Like what is the kind of our organization's role in tackling this transformation, or what is the specifically could be like restaurants right now are kind of in limbo, and the ones who can kind of collaborate and organize some way, new ways in which to work, new business models, things that maybe they've had a little bit some other services and catering things on the side, but now they kind of jump on those. So it's this kind of fluidity, and they understand that there's a great need, so they're anticipating this future need, and that's a kind of an important thing. So what is these new narratives for all industries?
Thank you.
I could continue from that in governmental level. In Finland, for example, we have a quite strong foresight profession, and we have good structures for using and producing future knowledge, but we could be more also in companies, but both public and private sector, we could use the knowledge more and reserve more time for having those discussions. It's not about lack of knowledge, but I think it's more how to use it and how to build capacity to use that knowledge, that we could be more prepared for surprises and to build resilience. I would like to talk resilience and capacity for renewal together, and how could we be more prepared for future crises or surprises. Is also about to building capacity for renewal, so that we have a long time perspective to our work or our actions.
Thank you. I guess this is all we have time for in terms of the questions here, but I think there's a lot of things, a lot of food for thought within the question section. So thank you to everyone who wrote their questions in.
I think I could add one more quick question, just on a personal note. How do you see your work going forward now? I guess maybe before some sort of crisis, people who are in futures and strategy might be seen as, worrying about things that'll never come, or, fear mongering. But now that we're in the situation, do you think that, your work will be kind of more in demand, that more people will be thinking about this?
Well, someone famously said that no one gets it 100% right 100% of the time. I think the key thing is that we engage in the discussion, and any feasible solution must be born out of collaboration. And I guess with regard to our profession, we are in the lucky position that things like Corona and the technological revolution accelerate change. And in times of rapid change, foresight shows its worth.
I would say that we have quite good tools in which to have this discussion and to facilitate this kind of collective discussion about something new and new directions, and what the future and what the long future would be, where there will be many economies, and you might find in the distant future something very, very attractive that actually we could start doing today. And so I think those kind of discussions, I've already been approached by different people who I haven't thought of before, to kind of to facilitate this kind of discussion. And I think this is like a really positive thing. but of course it can be, it needs to be like really enacted on. It's not about just going through the process and okay, we did that, you know, that was nice. But no, it's like really like, okay, who's gonna like hold on to this challenge and take it somewhere.
It's a bit similar for me. I finished my PhD exactly 10 years ago, and it was the first PhD in the world that looked at sustainable transformations from company innovation perspective. And I just basically didn't have a lot of audience at the time. Businesses did not think about, they did not think that they actually needed to include longer temporal horizons for their strategy making, etc. And I'm saying that that actually has changed in the past 5 years quite a lot, with the the dynamics, the environmental dynamics that are creating risks and the climate change impacts becoming immediately visible, etc. And with this particular, I think, crisis, or let's not call it a crisis because it's not only a crisis, but it's also something else. I do see that and hope that there is going to be more interest from businesses, particularly, to include longer term thinking into their strategy processes and innovation processes.
Okay, thank you. Really great notes to leave on. I guess that's basically it for the panel discussion. Thank you so much for all your words of wisdom, and I hope everybody watching has got some new tools and some new things to think about. Real quick before we end things, there's just a couple of slides for the next steps, basically, that I will share. We have a couple of things. Let's see here. So if you would like to share this recording or learn some more things or read about some of the things that were said here again later, we will have this shared to you via email if you were on Eventbrite and you registered, but also be on our blog. I'll show you the website in just a moment. Yeah, so we'll have a blog post, and we have another event coming up on June 5th. This is World Environment Day, and I'll show you that in a second. This event is, like I said earlier, a part of the We Don't Have Time Climate Conference. So there's a lot of content all week, basically 24/7 streams that are happening from all around the world. This is like a no-fly distributed conference. Really interesting how they put it together. So check this out at wedon'thavetime.org/Earth Day. And like I said, we have an event coming up on World Environment Day. If you want to register for that already, it's already up on Eventbrite. You can use this QR code or maybe just do a screenshot, and this will lead you to the Eventbrite registration. And for that, we're going to be highlighting commitments that are made to tackle the environmental issues from public, private, and university sector. And we'll have also kind of a theme about biodiversity. So we'll have an expert there talking about biodiversity. And this is basically it for us. So I will stop sharing, and I want to thank everybody for joining, and I hope to see you next time. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
you.
Much.
Bye.
Bye.